I appreciate the introduction, and I value the Treaty Land Acknowledgement. I'm going to do one too. I want to acknowledge that we're here at Treaty 6. Logan had mentioned, it was the treaty land between the Indigenous peoples and the Crown, and the idea was that this would be a sharing of the land to benefit all people. And I have certainly benefited as a settler from Treaty 2 territory. My ancestors came from Scotland, from England, and from countries unknown, but they were able to do things like purchase land, and that was because Indigenous people had been removed from those lands. They were able to raise their families in their own homes. They could speak their own languages. They could sell their goods. They could go to school where they wanted. They could vote. They haven't, and I haven't, been subjected to a lack of treatment of services. I haven't had my human rights trampled on because of the color of my skin, of who I am, where I come from. The same can't be said for the Indigenous people that lived here. So this is the beginning of Truth and Reconciliation Week, and as my commitment to TRC, what I want to do is work on education. That there's an onus on me for self-educating myself about the histories that aren't taught in the history books, and to move forward in a good way, working together. So one way we're trying to do that is to make sure that there's room for Indigenous voices, and I hope, my humble hope for tonight is that is one of the things that we do today, is make that space. So, as Logan indicated, my name is Tomasin Playford. I'm the Executive Director of the Saskatchewan Archaeological Society. The SAS is a non-profit charitable organization that promotes archaeological heritage in the province of Saskatchewan. We want everybody to understand, to care about, and help protect archaeological heritage in this province. As I was thinking about what I wanted to say here tonight, I couldn't help but thinking of the place where we're at. So we're here at the Round Prairie Library. It was named in a very respectful way in consultation with elders to honor the Métis communities that lived just by Whitecap Dakota Nation. They were buffalo hunters who wintered there. They lived there in the 1800s, and then they were removed from that landscape. There was the fallout of the resistance from 1885, and essentially they had to leave. They came back a few decades later, but the way of life was gone. The bison herds were gone, and so they started coming into this new city of wonder, Saskatoon, and they settled around the edges here, and they thrived. They maintained their community, they maintained their family units. But then the city started to grow and it pushed them out again. So they were removed from their road allowances. But the naming of this place speaks to the resiliency, the longevity of those people. They're still with us today. It's not surprising then that where we are is actually nearby archaeological sites. So just over basically from McDonald's to the schools. The school there is a bison processing and kill site. So this is a place where people were hunting 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. They were making a life, they were eating, they were raising their families, and that still continues here today. And that's one of the reasons why we really wanted to create this publication. We wanted to make sure it was inclusive of Indigenous perspectives. Archaeology, by its very nature, is colonial. It comes from a time of conquest. It comes from a time of imperialism. It comes from another country. Archaeology developed over in Europe. It came about at the time when there were notions of evolution were being formed, when the notions of cultural hierarchy theories were being developed. And it not only was part of that, it contributed to that. Modern archaeology, I'm just going to put that in air quotes, our salvation was science. We were going to be scientific. We were going to be impersonal. We were going to be objective, and we were going to have no feelings or emotions about the items that we were studying. And this is how I was taught. I feel very honored and fortunate that I went to an institution that had a professor that let us do field work when we were young. I came here, I did a degree at the University of Saskatchewan, but that way of teaching was so entrenched that that is how I was taught. It's hard to let that go. The objects didn't have beauty. They weren't beautiful. They weren't awe-inspiring. They weren't, they were 400 millimeters wide by 20 millimeters thick, and they have a distal basal notch of 2 millimeters, and they're made out of SiO2, right? That is how I was taught. But times change, and archaeology change, and our perspectives change. And this isn't to say that there wasn't other archaeologists who worked with Indigenous people. There's long been a collaboration with archaeology and Indigenous communities. What's different now today is the scope. Following that mantra of nothing about us without us. So it's involving Indigenous people right from the beginning of the process, not adding their contributions later, and not using their knowledge and their information and taking it for our own, and not using it simply to justify or add credence to our theories. It stands as its own knowledge. It's expert knowledge. It's valuable knowledge. And so when we first started thinking about the idea of a Saskatchewan-focused guidebook, so there are other guidebooks out there. There's ones for other provinces. There's no criticism of those books. But what they do is they present archaeology and the information in the books from that one-sided archaeological perspective. We knew when we wanted to do this, we wanted to do it in the spirit of reconciliation. We didn't want just the same thing. We wanted something for Saskatchewan, but it had to be more than just a repeat of what archaeologists think. And so it was really about including those Indigenous perspectives. And again, we were very fortunate to know people who were willing to share those perspectives with us. And that's why the first 4 chapters of the book are essentially 4 different Indigenous people with their own Indigenous perspectives on archaeology. This is not my knowledge, this is not my work, so I don't want to take ownership or talk about it at length. It will be available in the publication, and they have their words. But the book does start with a chapter by Audrey Drever. She is an artist, and she talks about her personal experience about how she came to first be exposed to archaeology through her sister, so through family, and how she talks about stone as being sacred beings. As an artist, she recognizes that the stone transforms, I love this, from landscape to sculpture. And I'd never thought of archaeology that way before, but it's true. She places Indigenous art in the political context of Eurocentric ideas of fine art, and how only sacred fine art and master paintings had counted as art when there was contact between Europeans and Indigenous people. How that disconnected Indigenous people from their art, and it removed that sacredness. She sees stone as sculpture, and it was just for somebody raised and trained to believe that this is impersonal, it's just an object, it's really a different way of thinking about it. The second chapter is by our very own Gabriel Lamarche. He does just a wonderful, skillful job of explaining the complexities and intricacies, the physics, the geometry of flintknapping in written word. I don't know anyone who's actually done it better than this chapter. It really is fantastic. It takes these very complicated concepts and translates it on the page. Even better though is when Gabe does it in person and he brings it alive, and I'm so honored and so happy he's with us today to do a demonstration. The third chapter is by Brian Scribe. It was an interview between Gabe and Brian. Brian is one of the pioneering Indigenous archaeologists on the prairies. He graduated, I would say, in the late 1990s. He was one of the first Indigenous archaeologists here in Saskatchewan. So he really was groundbreaking for this next generation. His chapter does a wonderful job of showing how Indigenous cultures are visible on the landscape if you know where to look and you know what to look for. Brian blends his own history from Cree and Lakota and Scottish, and he explains he grew up in Manitoba in the Interlake. He talks about the forest, he talks about the plains, he talks about the lakes. He was also very generous and shared in that chapter the challenges he faced. He was uncomfortable with some of the things he was being asked to do. And we didn't edit that at all. We were very cognizant of not editing any of the content from the chapters. It might be hard for archaeologists or hard for us to hear some of the things that's said in there, but it's our way to move forward. The next chapter is by Dr. Evelyn Siegfried. She was the curator of ethnology at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum for several years. I think she might even be moving into decades. But Evelyn brings with her that understanding of the collections. What she knows the legislation, because archaeology is legislated here through the Heritage Property Act. There's an act that tells us who and can't excavate sites and where do the artifacts go and how are they stored. And so she does a really good job of explaining that. She also calls out to people to take on personal obligation and ownership of stewarding collections if they have them. So there are a lot of collections in Saskatchewan that were created, especially during the 1930s, during the Dirty 30s, through cultivation, because it's the first time that land had been broken and the artifacts were being exposed. Some of those collections have been maintained. They've been passed down through generation. We are seeing a point in our history right now where people don't necessarily know what to do with those collections anymore. And they can be quite large. They can be thousands of artifacts, hundreds of documents. And so Evelyn argues that there is a fiscal responsibility by our Crown to maintain that information, to make sure that those collections aren't lost, that they're not given away or thrown away. This is the collective history of Saskatchewan. It's Indigenous material culture. Working with communities, working with Indigenous museums is a way forward for some of those collections. Now, this publication that we are making is a product of its time. It's a product of who we are and where we are today. And so we do include that archaeological perspective. And those are chapters 4 and 5 and 6. So we talk about, from the archaeological view, how do we understand projectile points? And of course, what I mean by projectile points is just the stone tip of a hunting weapon. They can also be made of bone. They can be made of ivory. They can be made of wood. They can be made of metal. But because most of the history here in Saskatchewan is from the time before contact with the rest of the world, and one of the most durable materials that we have is stone, it's one of the key artifact types that we as archaeologists use to try to understand what people were doing in the past. Because that's all archaeology is. It's not exciting. It's a little bit exciting, but it's not how they portray it in movies, in magazines, and books, right? It's not the thrill of discovery. We aren't discovering something. That people made those items already. They already existed. We are uncovering them and helping tell the story. We're interpreting them. Chapters in our chapter where we talk about the different projectile point types, our purpose for this is archaeologists have spent decades, I'd say almost centuries now, defining this. We group things. We like to put things into boxes. Things that look alike go alike. And there's a lot of reasons why we do this. We also can date them. We can use radiocarbon dating to tell us how old these are. And through this, we've developed what we call cultural chronologies. So there's patterning of these points through time. And that is primarily how archaeologists understand projectile points. It's not the only way, but it's probably the most common and the most current way. So our hope with this publication is that people who have items like this or who are interested in this can learn about it. They understand the importance of them, why it's imperative that we know where they came from, why it's important that they stay here. And that's the first step in making sure those collections are maintained, that they're curated. The other thing the book does is we also give guidance on what do you do if you find a site. So that's really important. The first step in protecting or preserving or stewarding any archaeological heritage is knowing it's there. There's a lot of myths out there about archaeology. That it's groundbreaking and exciting is one. But another myth is that, archaeology is there's gonna be a land claim on my land if I find this arrowhead in my backyard. That's not quite how it works, but there is some legislation about what you need to do if you find an artifact and who does it belong to. The idea is that it belongs to everybody. I'm not here to say that's correct or incorrect, but that is our current legislation. And so our book provides those steps and those guidelines on what to do if you find a site or what to do if you find artifacts. What we've done that's different from other guidebooks is we show the variability of the projectile point types. So this was my frustration as a student, trying to learn the different arrowhead, spear, and dart points. Well, what makes this point different from that point? And guidebooks are really, really great at explaining key differences. They would show you the perfect example of the perfect point, and that was it. But I don't find those perfect points. So where do they fit? And that's one thing that we worked really hard to do in this publication, is show that variability. We also highlight some of those point types that aren't well defined. One thing our publication isn't and doesn't do is it's not the be-all and the end-all about the point types. You have a lot of reading to do to try to figure that out. And the reality is, as archaeologists, we don't really know that. We interpret it, we theorize, we use evidence to support our arguments, but the people who know that were the people who made those artifacts hundreds, thousands of years ago. So anything that we're talking about is coming through our lens of how we're taught. So our hope with this publication is that people will read it, they'll understand how archaeology is used to understand material culture, that there are other perspectives in doing that, and that it will be a guide for them on how to be responsible in stewarding archaeological heritage. So with that, I would just like to conclude with a thank you to our funders. So of course, I want to thank the Young Canada Works and Canada Summer Jobs, because through them we were actually able to hire an intern. This was something else we recognized, is that we weren't going to be able to do this on our own in between all the other programs and services we offered. We wanted to do this right, and that meant dedicating time, a full-time position to this creation of this document. We're also very fortunate to have been funded through Creative Saskatchewan Book Publishing Grant. So we're very excited about that. We received some funding from the McLean Foundation. And then we are always very appreciative of our funding through the Saskatchewan Lotteries Trust Fund. So we're one of the heritage organizations that receives funding through SaskCulture, through the lottery system. And with that, it enables our capacity to do things like this, in addition to our other programs and services. I would, of course, like to thank Round Prairie Library for having us here today, and to SaskBooks for continuing to promote and encourage literacy through Saskatchewan Books Week. We're very grateful. Thank you. And we're going to take a very short break, and then we are going to do a Flintknapping demonstration with Gabriel Lamarche.
Okay, so lots of people have a perception that stone tools are just sort of random thrashing and bashing and, the crude products of crude minds. But the truth is, it's physics. There's patterns to it, it's geometry. And good Flintknapping is like good chess, where you're working several moves in advance. You're not just tackling the immediate piece of geometry in front of you, but you're working with that geometry to create a new geometry to set up for further flakes. So some of the base introductions of how it works. Have you ever shot a window with a BB gun? And it knocks out that perfect cone. That cone is called a Hertzian cone. And it happens because the material is strong in compression, but weak in tension. So when force enters into the material, it radiates out. And everywhere that's under compression tends to remain intact. But at the edge of that sort of radiating cone of force, where there's a pulling force away from the rest of the matrix, away from the rest of the material, that's where the tear actually occurs. And so Flintknapping is tearing the stone very quickly. Okay, so maybe I'll demonstrate that principle. So I'm going to strike down, probably about here, and we'll see. Maybe I'll do it on my hand. No. Just using a copper. There we go. Okay. So strike down everywhere that was being compressed tended to remain intact, but at the edge of that radiating cone of force, and you can even see the way it comes up there towards a peak where I struck and radiates out from that point. Flakes like this, often we treat them as just sort of debitage or waste flakes, but they're incredibly useful. Last week I watched someone skin most of a buffalo with this one. So when the flakes come off, they are incredibly sharp. Maybe I'll get another going underneath the cortex to demonstrate that. There we go. Okay. So when the flakes come off, they're already as sharp as razors. And so it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to produce a razor sharp, keen edge. And then as this gets dulled, then it needs to be resharpened and reflaked and reworked. That's where some of the more advanced flaking techniques come in that projectile points are made out of. And so a point like this, a piece like this would be finished into probably most of the middle period points started out as a spall, something like this. Yeah. I'm going to set that one aside and keep working a little. Oh, maybe I shouldn't whistle. Sorry. If anyone has any questions, or I can just keep rambling.
What are you doing right now?
Well, right now I am scrunching the edge. So, okay, there. That's another good principle. Okay. So, because the material is strong in compression but weak in tension, there's this sort of guideline rule you can apply to it to make it so that it's less risky to strike into the piece, because it is incredibly brittle stone. And so this guideline rule is called the centerline principle, and it can be summed up with, if you hit above the center line, you're going to have a bad time. And so what you have to do is, when you're looking at this piece, you have to imagine that there's a line that bisects the center of the mass here. And so what I really want to do is I want to set up to strike back this way, and before I can do that, I have to raise the edge up towards that, so that when I turn it over, now it's low. And the way I raise that edge up is I'm just tearing off small little short flakes from near the edge, just to sort of scrunch in that edge to bring it up a little higher, so that when I turn it over, it's now lower and safer to hit. So that's what I was doing there. Yeah. And so the reason you don't want to hit above center line is, if you do, you're actually compressing a massive area. As that force radiates out, if I was to strike up here, it'll be compressing a massive area, and it's strong in compression. And so in order to tear off that flake would require an immense amount of force, and often the forest will try to find an easier way to release, and so it's more likely just to snap the piece in half. And so instead, if we strike at or below the center line of mass, as that force radiates out into the piece, you'll be compressing a smaller area, so the fracture is mitigated and controlled, and so it can be predicted. As I'm working this piece, I'm really I'm trying to work it towards something that's kind of lens-shaped in cross-section, that once you have a piece that is roughly lens-shaped in cross-section, I've taken off all the cortex, then it can be finished into whatever you want. But you first have to get it towards that lens-shaped cross-section for bifacial napping anyway. Oh. Another aspect is spacing out the flakes. So I'm not stacking the flakes one on top of the other right next to each other. I'm trying to actually space them out, and that's because it leaves sort of in the at the intersection of these two flake scars, it leaves this ridge in between where kind of the cones of force meet. And these ridges we call arises. And for the later stage of flaking, these arises act as sort of like a spine, or like they help channel that compressive force inwards and help carry that force along. Whereas if it was to just travel through, say, a flat or a concave area, it wouldn't travel as well. So even now, as I'm taking these first flakes, I'm really setting up for the later series of flakes. And I'm constantly pausing to just gauge the angle. It's quite stout here, so I do have to be a little careful. Don't want it to step. I should be a little more careful. Scrunch down. So bifacial napping like this, as it began over 1 million years ago in Africa, and then it went through various sorts of phases and different sort of slants and styles to it over time. Neanderthals in Eurasia used a similar technique, not quite to what I'm doing now, but roughly similar. Maybe I should switch to the. No, it's too late. Okay. Neanderthals used a slightly different version of this sort of flaking technique. Archaeologists refer to it as the centripetal core technique. And it's just a way of working a round piece of stone into something more that produces many such flakes as this. Neanderthals did not practice bifacial napping, but very much. Maybe I'll throw that caveat. There we go. So now I'm going to start to turn the edge. And if you saw there, I'm starting to lean it and twist it. Again, I'm still trying to apply that center line rule, but I can bend it just by moving the piece out of the way. And now, if I strike down here, well, I'm well below center line. So there are ways to bend and twist that rule. Yeah, maybe what I'll do now is more like the centripetal core. I'll go a little faster. Doing.
Can you mention the videos?
The videos. Oh, sure. Yeah. So yeah, as part and parcel with the Point Book project, we paired with a videographer by the name of Matthias Chiefcalf. And so we recorded each of the defined projectile point types that we talk about in the book. We went through and I demonstrated how each of the different styles can be manufactured. And so there are a variety of different techniques used for each. This sort of large percussion work I'm doing, this is it wasn't used to make many points during any of the later periods, say any time during the past 2,000 years. It's a much older sort of technique. But yeah, so certain point types archaeologists often like to argue and bicker about. Fluting, what for? And so in that there's a little bit of discussion about some of those topics as well as just a general sort of how-to. I don't know if you can see this sort of scatter of debitage around me. Most of the time when archaeologists find a site, this is what remains of it, is these tiny little shards that all of these larger pieces are taken, because every single one of them is useful, that can serve as a knife for a nice long time, and then can be reworked into woodworking tool, and then transformed into a point for a while, and then reworked down into a scraper. And so often archaeologists in this area, where we do tend to be a little far from the major flint quarries, we often don't find such nice large examples of stone. So often we might just have handfuls of these little pieces. But there are still little clues left behind. So this tiny little flake here is what's called an aurelier. It's a very particular type of flake that only forms with large percussion. And I believe we could even refit it. Yep. You can even refit it into this one right here where it popped out. So even though we might only have that little aurelier left at a site, you can actually tell that a much larger flake was struck off from a much larger core just by that telltale secondary flake. Yeah. So learning to interpret this sort of mess can tell us a lot about other things that were going on at that site. So I don't know if you can see, each time I toss the flint off of my lap so that the subsequent flake doesn't drive it in, I'm also gauging the angle of what I'm working with. I know it seems like I'm just kind of quickly thrashing and bashing away here, but there's a little bit more pause and consideration. Yeah. With every strike, I'm considering the angle, and with every glance at it, I'm considering the angle and the convexity of that eris, of these ridges I'm intentionally leaving behind for the later stages. And I'm kind of gauging the strike angle I will need to make in order to drive into that, and also gauging that spot on the edge, considering if I need to scrunch it or abrade it or make it stout enough in order to actually absorb that force I want to deliver into it. Yeah.
So why are you using that?
I could switch. I like using copper. Copper is it has the density of like stone, or even more so, but it's soft like antler. It has some give to it. You can't really use hard brass or steel to do any refined flaking. You can do some short stout flakes with it, but it's too hard. It doesn't grip the edge and it punches too hard. Copper is soft enough to grip the edge. Antler is as well, but you have to, because it's not as dense, you have to swing it harder in order to impart the same amount of force. And because you have to swing it harder, it's harder to be accurate with it. And so copper is a nice forgiving little in-between. Gotta be careful. I should have Braid these edges. I gotta stop in a braid. Okay. It's sharp enough. I'm gonna cut myself. I first started trying to flint knap, probably when I was like 10. And I was lucky to grow up in an area that had some decent chert. It's like a kind of flint that forms in limestone. And I recognized it didn't break like the other stones, that there was particular qualities to it. So I first started experimenting, and when I was a kid, like I had this misunderstanding that like I thought you had to. I thought you had to start off like a really soft strike and then just slowly build up force in order for it to be successful. What I actually realize now is that no, I was just abrading the edge to make it stout enough so that a later harder strike can knock off that piece. When I was a kid, I just didn't quite understand that. No, that's two separate steps. But yeah, after enough time and practice, it became clearer. Yeah. It's kind of like I don't know, it's a 3D puzzle in a way. It's a little bit like a Rubik's Cube. We don't often think of stone tools in that way, right? We think of them as just, a Krug smash. But no, there's really, I'm really building up to, I want to remove this chalky cortex here. And so how do I do that? Well, I have to find a way where mass comes closer to the edge that I can use to kind of channel that force inwards. So there's a ridge of mass here that comes there. But now here, that edge is too low. If I was to go like this, it's too high up on center line. If I strike there, the whole issue. I'll be compressing a massive area, it won't go. If it does, it'll snap the piece in half. But I can alter that center line. Come on, there we go. There we go. Take off one flake there, and really with that flake, I'm setting up this low spot here that will then allow me to direct force in along that ridge. Just going to isolate it with one more. Okay. I need to not whistle. Again, abrade it so that it will absorb sufficient amount of force. How much abrading is too much? How much abrading is not enough? If I don't abrade it sufficiently and I strike into it, that flake won't run the full distance. It'll start and then it will encounter more mass than it can actually remove, and it will just snap off. We call that a step fracture. And so I do have to abrade it enough to remove that flake I intend to remove. Someone could calculate this if they wanted to, but it's just the sort of thing you have to gain a more intuitive understanding of how much is enough. Let's get this out of the way. And again, gauging my angle. I don't want to strike too far into it. So when I strike, again, that force is going to radiate out about 55, 60 degrees. And so I have to transpose my strike about 55, 60 degrees off of the angle I want that flake to initiate at. So that's why I keep gauging and then turning it down to try to visualize where that 55, 60 degree angle is. Part of it. I'll try again.
How did you learn all this?
Tonnage. A lot of experimentation, part of what I call the Goldilocks method. You know, you just have to screw up every which way till you find what works. And part of it was study and looking into things like, well, you know, in physics, what is a cone of force? How does that function? But yeah, a big part of it is just putting in the hours and practice. Of when you strike it and the flake didn't go the way you expected it to go, why? Study that flake, why? Until you can understand how it behaves when you strike it. And so this is something, yeah, every ancient flint napper who was any good, this is something they had to do. You have to put in the hours. No matter how good your instruction is, you still have to put in the hours to really come to an intuitive understanding of how the stone fractures. And so once you gain that sort of understanding, sometimes you can also see certain patterns in ancient artifacts as well. You know, sometimes you can see that a person made an error with a strike, and then you can see their attempt to try to correct for that, and that one may, you know, there may have even been a bit of desperation or something, that another error was created, and then you can almost just empathize with this mounting frustration with this damn rock. Yeah. And so that's one of those very sort of human things that we don't often think about when we think of prehistoric archaeology. Those very human errors. So I'm going to try again and try to direct a little bit more of the force in this way. Part of it. Try one more. There were some very good books on flintknapping. D.C. Waldorf has a good one. I think an archaeologist by the name of Whittaker has a good one. But a lot of what they have written, it can all, a lot of it can be traced back to an Indigenous man called Ishi of California. Maybe I'll just, yeah. You can read all about it in our book, available at fine bookstores everywhere. It is an aspect of sort of human heritage that was almost lost in the last century. But today it's going through a bit of a revival. Many more people are becoming interested in it now that sort of the prejudice of like, oh, the savage is beginning to fade, and people are starting to actually be genuinely curious in how ancient people thought and behaved. No, I gotta keep going. Jeez, needs to be some background music or something. If anyone has any questions, by all means, I don't mind. If not, I can keep rambling, humming, trying not to whistle. Let's see, many sorts of stone in this area is often hard to come by. Good stone. It was often traded long distances. So again, people often have this perception that ancient people were just like raccoons and just scurrying around and scavenging whatever they can from around them. But in truth, most of the stone at any given site in Saskatchewan is probably, from many kilometers away. Often, if there's any formal points, any finished points, it's often from hundreds of kilometers away. Knife River Flint, Quarry of the Ancestors near Fort Mac. So good stone was often traded very long distances, and often hundreds or sometimes even thousands of kilometers. And so sometimes it's almost hard to square with our perception of the ancient people who are just, well, I'm on the land, I guess. Oh, look, a squirrel. Oh, look, a buffalo. And it's like, no. You have to incorporate into your understanding of that many of their tools were from geological deposits hundreds of kilometers away, right? So, like, factoring that into our understanding, it's almost hard to do sometimes. I suppose not. We have Walmart, but we don't think about it. We don't have to think about it. Ancient people did.
Where does the stone for Flintknapping come from today?
This piece is from Texas. I like this stuff because it's quite large. You know what they say about Texas. Yeah, it's the same of their. It's the same of their chert. It's easy to find large pieces, and so it's really nice for demonstrations like this. We do also have other similar sort of shaped cherts, or chalcedony or siltstones in Saskatchewan, but they're much smaller. And so, it would be a lot harder for you guys to see if I was just up here. You wouldn't really be able to see very much, but with these larger pieces, it's more dramatic. So around the Pasqua Hills, east of Nipawin, and in the Carrot River area, in the shales in there, there's a really nice black flint. It's called Gronlid siltstone. It's some of the best stuff in Saskatchewan, but it's really hard to locate there in those shales. There's also Knife River Flint from the Knife River Flint quarries in North Dakota, as well as there may be nearer sources. I've heard of some near Blackstrap Lake. Further north, there's not much further north. A lot of people were working with bedrock quartz, which is a brutally tough material to try to extract from the bedrock. I mean, people, literally had to dig it out of granite and gneiss bedrock. And just imagine trying to extract a narrow, very brittle stone from surrounded on all sides from much tougher stone. It's quite an arduous task to do so without breaking the brittle one in the middle. But people did it.